A very warm welcome back to our Brain Talks podcast. I'm Sam Pauly, and throughout this series of 12 podcasts, we're looking ahead to the European Brain Council's Brain Innovation Days in October this year. To do that, throughout the series, we're being joined by some of the top innovators in the brain research area. We've been hearing about some of the exceptional work and findings, but of course, many questions remain unanswered, and ongoing research is essential. But for researchers, access to funding is highly competitive and often requires initial pilot research data for which funding may be lacking. One organisation addressing this challenge is the European Association of Neurosurgical Societies, or EANS, through their EANS Research Fund. Today, we're going to be hearing more about the fund and its mission, as well as taking a look at some of the innovative work that it's supporting. And to tell us more, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Asgeir Jakola, Director of the EANS Research Fund and a neurosurgeon at Sahlgrenska University Hospital in Gothenburg, Sweden, and Dr. Victor Staartjes, a neurosurgery resident at the University Hospital Zurich, where he also leads the Machine Intelligence in Clinical Neuroscience Laboratory. A very warm welcome to you both, and many thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you for having us.
Now, let me start, Asgeir, by asking you a little bit more about the EANS Research Fund itself. Why was it set up, and what's its mission?
Well, first of all, it was set up to really, enhance the possibilities of young neurosurgeons to sort of succeed with the clinician and research path, which is quite difficult. And secondly, it was also to stimulate research data, pilot data, so that we could enhance neurosurgical research in more competitive, larger application and larger grants like the EU grants and so on. So both targeting the young neurosurgeons and the pilot data.
And how much of a challenge from your experience is funding for researchers, finding funding for researchers across Europe?
For this specific category of people, those who are not that merited yet, the younger researchers or wanting to become researchers, it's quite difficult to find suitable grants to get going. So this seeding grant is also much welcome in the society. We have high pressure of applicants. So unfortunately, it's quite competitive as of now, actually, in that sense. Yeah.
And presumably, though, there is a high risk associated with the sort of funding that you're providing. Is that right?
High risk in terms of if you don't have pilot data, you don't really know how the experiments are going. So in that sense, you could be funding something that doesn't really carry on to make it and to be a useful application or findings and so on. So in this stage of research, it is more risky, but the amount that we are as a research fund are providing is not, it is seeding grants. So in that sense, it's not that high risk.
Victor, let me bring you in here because your research received a grant from the fund and you've been running a pilot on aiding surgeons with orientation in the brain. Can you just tell us, to start with, a little bit more about the work that you've been doing and what's the final goal of the work?
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, as you've already said, the basic goal in the end is to be able to increase the safety of surgery and to increase the performance of neurosurgeons in terms of guidance during surgery. So we want to help surgeons orient themselves during surgery because actually, usually we know where we are, but sometimes if everything is full of blood, we are flushing everything, we have to flush everything, then it can be sometimes hard to orient yourself. So what we wanted to do is to try and teach a machine vision algorithm to work like a master surgeon, and based on the view that you have through the microscope or endoscope to actually identify all the relevant anatomical structures, which helps you avoid complications by going somewhere you shouldn't go.
And how have you been going about the research itself? What questions have you been trying to answer, and what process have you been taking?
Yeah, so this, we knew from the start that it was going to be a very long-term project. So, of course, it started with serendipity, which is this idea that, how can it be that, when I look through the microscope, I just started neurosurgery residency. Sometimes I really get lost, especially during the end of surgery when everything is already kind of destroyed, especially in kind of tumor cases. And I was always wondering, how can it be that like these master surgeons who've done thousands of surgeries, even if everything's full of blood, they know exactly where they are. So what we thought to ourselves was, wouldn't it be possible, if a human can do this, shouldn't the computer be able to do this as well, or even possibly better than even an expert surgeon, through the power of being able to go through thousands of hours of videos from past surgeries and learning like that. So that was our basic question at the beginning: if it's possible to teach anatomy to an algorithm. Difficulty with this was, as always in machine learning, to get good data, and because the goal is, of course, to improve performance. That means that the quality of the data, so the labeling of the data, especially in these difficult situations where we want the algorithm to help us, has to be very high. And that was the very first crucial thing that we had to get through, is to how do we get a huge amount of very high quality labeled data in a short amount of time. And that's where the grant kind of came in.
And how did that grant help in that respect?
Well, so we applied to the grant with a tiny little pilot study that we had done based on just a couple dozen patients, where my chief and I we labeled surgical videos of pituitary surgeries. So we chose pituitary surgery, which goes actually through the nose to the very middle of the head, where the pituitary gland is. We chose that because it's very simple and reproducible anatomical corridor. So this was perfect it's perfect testing ground, perfect sandbox. And it was very painful it took painfully long to label all these videos, and you really need an expert surgeon to label them. So what the grant enabled us was to pay a very experienced neurosurgical resident from Bologna, who has a lot of experience in this specific kind of surgery, to come to Zurich, and he actually spent 6 months doing basically only labeling of hundreds of cases in very high quality, and that has now enabled us to really take the next step and train more accurate models, which now have shown that it seems to be possible to teach an algorithm to detect anatomy.
I was going to ask what your findings were. Is it possible that so, how hopeful do you feel from your findings then? What's next?
Well, I mean, we have to be a bit cautious with that, because it's really just at the beginning, and as I said, this is rather, it's probably rather one of the more simpler problems or anatomical areas in neurosurgery. But still, the basic premise that we had was, can we teach an algorithm to detect anatomy without providing an anatomical map beforehand? So we didn't do that. The algorithm really learned everything just by looking at cases, just like a master surgeon. That definitely we can say it seems to be possible. So that's nice. Yeah. Before
Asgeir,
this
let me
could be
bring
actually
you.
used, though, there is a lot of validation steps that have to be done, and we need to be much more accurate even.
Well, Asgeir, let me bring you back in, because throughout the series of podcasts, we've been talking about innovation, and of course, innovation can come in so many forms. What, if anything, do you find particularly innovative in this work that Victor's been doing?
Well, not knowing every detail of his algorithm and the technicalities. From what I understood when talking with Victor earlier on, I think that the technical novelty in terms of algorithms and the engineering part is not that novel, and this is something that we quite often see, and at times it can be difficult to gain engineering enthusiasm about more of the application part. So it's taking something that is more or less well known in one community, and there is a technology gap, and then you try to close it with some application. And this is some sort of recycling, a novel use of a known technology, so to speak. And in that sense, I think it's innovative and novel and useful.
Victor, would you add anything to that in terms of the innovative approach, or what you find innovative about your work?
I mean, I would only, accept what Asgeir said and add that, really, it's exactly what he said. Um, there is always a technology gap. So when doctors try to do machine learning research, it is, as always, the most crucial factor in research and innovation is collaboration. So, as Asgeir said, the actual development of the machine learning models was relatively easy for the people that we collaborated with at the ETH, which is the technical university in Zurich. For us, it would have been very hard, but for them, this was an easy problem. The only thing is, why this has never been done is you have to have the idea, and then you have to have very high quality data. And this is exactly what we talked about. This is what has been made possible by the research fund, and this is also, I guess, also a special opportunity in Zurich, because we've recorded all the videos since over 15 years, and they're all stored here. So it has been a unique, how do you say, collaboration with the ETH, very specialized in machine vision laboratory there, and nice data that we have.
And Oscar, from your perspective, this must be a great example of the grant really being of value.
Yeah, and it definitely fulfill its purpose, I would say, being creating this pilot data. I don't know how it has gone with other funding and so on for Victor later, but I mean, from what I've heard, I know that some of the microscope and endoscope, producers and the industry are quite interested, and Victor is a young neurosurgeon, definitely in the group who we want to stimulate, and also as a community say that we really appreciate young neurosurgeons taking on this dual path of clinician and scientist.
And do you think that's going to be a trend for the future then, Oscar, that sort of dual path?
Not for everyone. No, it will be for some people, has always been, but it is a difficult balance, and both takes time. And when you're a young neurosurgeon, many of us, or I'm not that young anymore, but I mean, for many of them, it's you want to operate and you want to be in the operating room, you want to perform surgeries, and so we need to stimulate this other side of it as well, and I think this is important.
Going back to the work that you've been carrying out, Victor, and let me ask you both this: what real-world applications do you think this work and benefits could this work give us in the future? I know you touched a little on it earlier, but Victor, but yeah, maybe give us a few examples.
Well, I mean, apart from the first thing that I already mentioned was, to maybe avoid complications by increasing the orientation, which would be one thing with the current application in pituitary surgery. If you want to take out the pituitary tumor, you have to go through the two carotid arteries in between them, and it's not always so easy to see where exactly they are under the bone, and you have to cut into the bone relatively blindly. And in about 1% of the cases, we inadvertently injure the carotid artery. So our model is able to identify the carotid artery under the bone relatively well, So that's one actually practical example how we can avoid very specific complication. And the other thing is, and I think Asgeir will talk a little bit about this more, is surgical training. So when I look at a lot of the learning that you do is by, well, first of all, assisting and looking in surgery, but also looking at operative videos of famous surgeons, and you can very quickly get lost. And this algorithm could also help by always labeling the most important landmarks, so you can keep your orientation. This could be very useful. And just a general thing I like to mention about this kind of technology is scalability. So the nice thing about this kind of software or about these kinds of algorithms is that, for example, the current algorithm that we have, which is based on a technique called YOLO, is it is very hard to develop. It needs a lot of computing power, etc., to develop. But the actual final product can run even on a phone. So this could be rolled out anywhere in the world to help surgeons anywhere, even in rural areas, compared to other innovations like robotics, expensive machines, fluorescence, etc., which is just harder to implement than if you haven't. I think that's one of the main examples. And then, of course, this is just a technique that we've developed, like a pathway that can also be applied to other surgeries. So, for example, laparoscopic abdominal surgery. It would be very easy to scale this to that.
Oscar, any other real world applications that you could see this work being useful for? And Victor did mention education. Perhaps you'd like to elaborate on that any further?
Yeah, well, it is well known that, and a concern, I would say, that the people coming out as specialists in neurosurgery today compared to, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, even they have less surgeries in their belt. They have performed less surgeries. They have probably overviewed less surgeries, and in that sense, education, good content to be able to perform better education, use and reuse the cases more often, and to also not only look at atlases and where you get this perfect image, bloodless, maybe dissection anatomy, which is not the same as Victor say. Sometimes things are a bit distorted, things do have some blood on it, and it's not all the time perfectly prepared for it. So these real world educational videos would be, I think, most helpful to boost the confidence and numbers and to get known with the anatomy.
But we talked a little bit earlier, more generally, about the challenges of carrying out research. And perhaps I could ask you both, and Oscar, I'll come to you first. What challenges do we still face in terms of carrying out research, and what do you like to see being done to enable and better support research?
Well, first of all, yeah, it's a huge question, right? But coming from this clinical side, I am really passionate about that. We need this dualness that we talked about before. We need clinicians to that are also active clinicians, not only have an MD several years back, but we need people to be in the clinic to know clinical questions, and that's how this hypothesis of Victor has developed. Because sometimes you get lost. This would be useful if you're not there. If you don't know the clinical problems, you cannot ask the right questions, right? So for me, I would there are many issues and many problems with funding and everything. But I mean, for me, it would be to support to enable clinicians to really stand in this dual role and to take a leading part both on the academic side but also on the clinical side.
And Victor, anything you'd like to add to that? What do you think could be done to better enable or better support research?
Well, I mean, I agree with Asgeir, but I would also like to add that one of the difficulties, and I will be always talking about the same word, which is data, getting good data. So that means not only quantity, but also quality. And of course, it's even harder to get high quantity data. And the only way to do that is collaboration, especially in Europe. I would say actually that the EANS, within the EANS, we're very good at doing international studies. I think we really excel doing that. But especially in machine learning with videos and high amounts of data that are, of course, privacy sensitive, it's been getting more difficult to share data. So to get data from one center to another. There's even machine learning approaches to try and get around this called federated learning. But one of the important things would be, in my opinion, to also focus on discussing ways to more easily share data within Europe, which would really strengthen the European brain research compared to, the US and Asia, where for some reason it's much easier to get, these huge case loads even in one center. I think in Europe it's very crucial to collaborate, and it's just been getting, rightfully so, the privacy laws have become much tighter, so it's been very difficult actually to get started. Sometimes it takes us years to get the contracts done to transfer data from one center to another. The other thing is also legislation about, actually applying these things. So for machine learning, for these kind of machine learning models, is actually relatively unclear. It's kind of a gray zone what kind of validation and what kind of certifications are necessary, and some working groups on these points would also be helpful for sure.
I would just
Asgeir, I could see you nodding your head. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, this is very important. I'm glad Victor brought it up. It's the sometimes the slowness and the cumbersomeness, and this would not be so difficult if if it was clear to everyone what was expected and how a standardized contract should look like and who should sign it. But especially for smaller institutions, this wanting to share their data, this is a huge mountain to climb. Sometimes you get the right person to have the right authority, and it just gets stuck. And this is a very, very common problem for all of us who try to collaborate.
Victor, we have been hearing a lot there about the challenges, but can you put then into perspective, personally, even for you, how important to you or to your work has this funding from EANS been?
Of course. I mean, it's been very important because it has really allowed us to move from this, tiny proof of concept pilot stage towards a, really testing it out with enough data, which has been enabled by the grant that allowed us to pay an expert to label all these videos. And this then takes us to the next step, which is applying for much bigger grants, which allow us to engage PhD students on this project fully. A lot of funding organizations will not fund anything without at least some kind of proof of concept. Because I can understand that, at the beginning one would say, hey, it's probably not possible to teach machine vision algorithm to recognize these structures, but at least now we have some basis to show that that this should be possible, especially with more data and better, more granular training. So that's really where the grant has come in. Without it, as Asgeir already mentioned at the very beginning, the very start of such a long project is the most difficult, and that's where a lot of projects kind of fade away. And we are very grateful to the EANS for the support.
Time is marching on, so let me just bring it to a close with a final thought from you both. What would you say, and Victor, I'll come to you first, and Asgeir, I'll leave you with the last word. So what would you say do you feel is the future of research? What can be achieved, or how hopeful are you feeling for the next decade, for example? Victor?
I mean, I think that, if we can get around the problems that we talked about before, about data sharing, which is getting very difficult, Of course, I do machine learning research, so I think this is the next big revolution, is to really introduce artificial intelligence and machine learning into clinical science, because a lot of research is being done on machine learning, but there's almost no studies, or really at least no randomized, high quality studies that have ever shown a benefit of applying machine learning in clinical science. So we have to move, like with our study, from just the in silico research to really applying it and showing actual benefits. Because otherwise, in some parts of this, we can essentially stop doing it, like prediction models. Huge amount of time is spent on that, but we don't know if they actually change any decisions. So I think that will be one of the very exciting frontiers also with our study. We plan to soon apply this in the microscope, in the endoscope, to see if it actually helps at all.
Asgeir, and for you, what's your feeling of the future of research? What could we be achieving, and how hopeful are you perhaps for the next sort of foreseeable future, the next decade, perhaps?
Well, talking about neurological and neurosurgical research, and also taking into account this year's EANS Research Fund process, which had very high quality, I would say. But there is a high focus on things like networks of the brain, which is highly interesting, human connectome project and so on. And there are machine learning projects like Victor working with. And I think there are very important technical novelties as well in surgery, like robotics and stuff like that. So there will be in neurosurgical planning and stuff like that, it will be a process and a progress that we will see and feel. I'm not sure it will be in short term revolutionary, like when we introduce the microscope, for instance, but I think there will be a refinement, definitely, for the better, for patient security and optimization.
Well, that's a great and optimistic note to finish on. That's all we have time for today, and it's been a real pleasure to hear more about not only the exciting work that you've been carrying out, Victor, but also the vital funding that's been enabling this work. And I know we'll be putting some video links to some of Victor's work in the podcast description, so you can have a look at those if you've been listening or watching. Finally, I'd like to thank both of our panelists for joining us today, and a big thank you to everyone who's been listening or watching. Do join us again soon for another podcast as we look ahead to the Brain Innovation Days and continue to explore the brain in the life course. Until next time, bye-bye.